On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one, because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, but in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time. So Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Don noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Don extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Don was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him. But then again, Don didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Don drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Don treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Don, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, His first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Don had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Don made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Don was late. Don got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Don told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Don dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Don's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual, since Don was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Don a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. And now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Don to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor, and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Don's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red streaked wall. and when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. Two women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Fluitt. The two women outside were his co-workers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Dawn's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Dawn's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Dawn's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Dawn's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Dawn. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, and so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Dawn Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Dawn was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him. And he said that actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Dawn did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Dawn's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Dawn's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Dawn's killer was someone Dawn knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Dawn was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Dawn Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers who had called 911 had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Don, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe he had gotten into it with another driver and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Don's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room, where Christine and Sienna were sitting, and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Don didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Don had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Don. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Don's side. As for the night of Don's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Don's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Don's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Don's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Don and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Don's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Don's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Don driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Don's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Don's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Don's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage. And all at once, it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Dawn into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Dawn is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Dawn was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Dawn, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015. A little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Dawn had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Dawn were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Dawn never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Dawn was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Dawn's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Dawn's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Dawn's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Dawn's neighbors that Dawn and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Dawn's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Dawn. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Don's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don, as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Don, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Don dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Don's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Don was so great, because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Sienna. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it, but finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Don came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door and then open the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Don was like, "What's going on?" and coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Don opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here, and so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Don stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Don was dead, they also went into Don's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Don's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could, but they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life, but by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder, and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Don's fingernails that belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Don's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Sienna to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. One night in late January of 1965, a police officer named Fareed Jaber, along with another officer, his partner, were walking along a beach in Antilias, Lebanon, which is a tiny village just north of Beirut. The weather was absolutely terrible. It was freezing out, it was pouring rain, and it's nighttime, so it's dark out. I mean, this is a pretty nasty time to be out, walking around. As much as Fareed and very likely his partner would have desperately liked to have been home in bed right now, they knew that, they both needed this job, especially Fareed. It paid well and he couldn't afford to lose it, and so sometimes doing this job, being a cop, was pretty uncomfortable, and he'd sort of just accepted that. Now, the reason that Fareed and his partner were out here right now patrolling this beach in this terrible weather was because somebody had called in and said that they saw something odd on the beach, and they thought maybe it could be a dead body, or it could just be a body, period. They didn't know, but there was something odd on the beach, and so the police were called to go have a look. Now, this part of Lebanon was considered pretty safe, so, the idea of bodies turning up sort of out on the beach or out, in public anywhere was just sort of unheard of. And so Fareed and his partner really didn't expect to walk up on a dead body or something. In fact, Fareed really just expected to find some dead sea creature or something, or maybe some trash, he didn't know what. But as he's walking along with his jacket pulled around tight and he's scanning the beach with his flashlight, battling the weather, he just felt kind of annoyed that they were out here. Like, this is gonna be nothing. Like, why are we even being called out here? There's no way there's literally a body on the beach right now. But sure enough, as Fareed and his partner continued walking along the beach, looking around with their flashlights, far down the beach, right in the middle of the sand, they did see this odd object just laying out on the sand. And even at first glance, from a distance, it did look human-like. It definitely had the form where it could be a person. And so right away, Fareed and his partner are like, clearly that's what was called in. This is what we're here to investigate. Now, the two of them didn't run over to whatever this was. They have no idea what's going on here. I mean, if this really is a person, they don't know why they're here, if there's somebody that hurt them that's in the vicinity. So they're playing it safe. They're walking up slowly, scanning the whole beach, looking for any other indication of, whatever this is. Maybe there's other things that are odd on the beach, but there was nothing. It was just this odd body-like thing on the sand. But as they got closer, Fareed in particular, he's looking at this object and he's like, that is definitely a person. I can tell that's a body on the ground. But there was just something odd about the body. It just looked off. There was just something unnatural about it. There's something that he couldn't put his finger on, but he's gonna find out when he gets close. And so Fareed and his partner, they get closer and closer, and both their flashlights are trained on this human-like thing, and then finally they're standing right over it, and they look down, and for sure, this is a person. But they could now see, now that they're right up close, why this person seemed off. And it was because this body was missing its head. Now, right away, it seemed fairly apparent to Fareed and his partner that this body, one, belonged to a man, and two, very likely they did not die of like an accidental drowning and get washed up on shore or something. Very likely, especially because of the decapitation, this man was murdered. Somebody killed him and likely dumped him here, or maybe dumped him in the water and then he washed up here. But this is foul play. And so Fareed and the partner, they're like, okay, we gotta search the area, do a cursory search and just make sure, whoever did this isn't just nearby. We need to secure the scene. And so they drew their guns and they walked the area, but there was nobody else there. The beach is totally, desolate, minus this body and the police officers. And so after doing that cursory search and coming back to the body, Fareed and his partner began talking about like what they were gonna do. Now remember, this is the mid-1960s in a small rural village in Lebanon. So this is not like a robust police department that Fareed and his partner were a part of. They did not have, huge resources to process this, vicious homicide, or at least what it looked to be a vicious homicide. They didn't even have radios to call in backup. I mean, they knew at best what they'd be able to do here is maybe by tomorrow, they could have a couple more officers come out and begin to investigate and see what happened here. But just to do that, it would require literally going back to the station and rallying support and explaining what's going on and coming up with a plan and going out and doing that. And so as they're sort of talking through what they should do, because again, also remember, this is not an area where homicides take place either. I mean, this is pretty anomalous. So they don't even necessarily know how to process a homicide, but they say, okay, our best bet is one of us just needs to stay here with the body, basically guard the crime scene. And the other will go back to the station and file the paperwork and get this machine in motion so that tomorrow we can actually begin investigating. So basically one of them would have to stay the night literally on the beach in the freezing cold and the rain next to this dead body to make sure nobody came back to claim it or desecrate it in some way. And as they're talking about who was going to do that, Fareed was the more junior officer, and so pretty quickly it became clear that he was going to have to do it. And again, going back to the earlier part in the story where Fareed, he knew this job could be very uncomfortable sometimes, but he needed this job. He needed the income. He couldn't afford to lose this job. And so when it was sort of clear this was going to be his doing, he said, fine, I'll stay here. I'll stay with the body. You go, get the investigation started, and I'll see you tomorrow. Now, after Fareed's partner had left and had walked down the beach and disappeared, Fareed sort of realized just how bad this night was going to be. I mean, think about it. Not only is the weather awful, but he's literally, sitting next to a decapitated body. He's going to be just, in the company of this dead body all night. And on top of that, he suspects that somebody has killed this guy. This guy's been murdered. And maybe this body has been dumped here by the murderer. And even though they did a cursory search, it wasn't like 100% certain that the killer or killers were not somewhere in the area. And so Fareed's thinking okay, I have to guard the body and be careful not to get attacked by the killer who could be, nearby. I mean, this is like straight out of a nightmare. But, at the same time, Fareed's thinking to himself, I'm a trained police officer. I have my issued gun and my issued knife. I'm not completely defenseless here. If somebody were to come out here and attack me, I could hold my own. I could defend myself. And so he's at least telling himself that. And so as the rain continues to just pound down on Fareed, he's shivering, he's miserable. He knows he's supposed to be alert and, watching this crime scene. He's not supposed to sleep. But he's so uncomfortable that he finds himself getting down on the sand and kind of, getting into the fetal position, trying to find a little bit of comfort. And at some point he does get a little comfortable, in fact, so comfortable that despite how awful it was outside, he did fall asleep at about maybe 2, 3 in the morning. And so Fareed falls asleep, and then a few hours later, He wakes up and he's in a panic because he knows he wasn't supposed to fall asleep. He's supposed to be guarding this crime scene to make sure nobody touches this body. And also remember, he thinks the killer could be out here, like it's an actual real possibility they might come back and do something to the body. And he's just fallen asleep. And so he kind of scrambles to his feet. He's taking stock of the scene. It's still raining. It's still cold and dark out. And he turns and he looks where the body was supposed to be, and it's gone. The body is gone. And so instinctively, he's thinking, oh, the killer's nearby. They must have grabbed the body. He reaches for his gun, and his holster's empty. And so now it's like truly a nightmare scenario for Fareed. He was supposed to be here to watch the crime scene, and he allowed the body to be taken, and he's been disarmed. Now, fortunately, he had his, service knife, and he pulled that out. That's all he's got at this point. But he's thinking, I'm screwed. Like, what happened? Where did it go? Where'd the body go? Where'd my gun go? What do I do? And so he starts thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe an animal came by and grabbed the body and dragged the body, and it's nearby. And he's sort of like looking up and down the beach, and he's thinking, it could be pretty far away, but he sees there's no drag marks. There's no way the body could have been dragged by an animal. And then also what, an animal came back and unclipped his holster and took his gun out and took that away? That doesn't make any sense. He would have at least woken up if that was happening. But then he's like, well, wait a minute, maybe a wave came up and grabbed the body and dragged it into the ocean. That's why it's not here. That's why there's no drag marks. But he looked at where he was sleeping, and almost certainly if the body had been struck with a big wave that dragged it into the ocean, Fareed would have been hit by that same wave and he would have woken up. And then also, again, who took his gun? And so the realization hit Fareed that the only explanation here is a person came over here while I was asleep, took the body, took my gun, and now they're gone. So the night before, Fareed, the officer who was, left on the beach to guard the scene, the one who fell asleep, Fareed, his cousin, a man named Habib Jaber, had been walking along the beach alone when he had been attacked. This man had robbed him and then killed him and decapitated him. And he had left Habib's body on the shore. But he had taken his head and the money he had stolen from him back to his home. But several hours later, the killer realized maybe it had been a mistake to leave so much evidence behind, namely leaving behind the headless body. Maybe that could get them in trouble. So they decide, okay, I'm gonna go back and get the body and bring it here as well to get rid of the evidence. But when the killer got back to the beach, back to the crime scene, he saw the body was now being guarded by a police officer. And that police officer was Fareed. Now, it's very important that you understand that Fareed, the officer, had no idea that the body he was guarding belonged to his cousin. All he knew was that this was a man who was killed. But because he was missing his head, he had not been able to identify him as his cousin. He just thought it was some stranger, some man had been killed, not his cousin. Now, when the killer got to the beach, he was about to turn around because he sees I can't do anything because, this officer is guarding the body, what can I do? But he snuck up a little bit closer and he realized the police officer, Fareed, he had fallen asleep on the job. And so while Fareed was sleeping, the killer did walk up, pick up the body, carry it off to his house, which was not far away. And he also went back and he took Fareed's gun out of his holster, all while Fareed was asleep. So literally the worst thing that Fareed thought could have happened, that he was basically duped by the killer while he slept, did happen. So after the killer has taken the body and the gun away from Fareed and he's back at his home down the beach, he decided what he would do is he would start a big fire and he would dispose of the body that way. He would burn it in the fire and that would get rid of all the evidence and he'd be just fine. And so as the killer is chopping up firewood, basically at the end of the beach, not far from Fareed, believe it or not, he's chopping up all this firewood. Fareed wakes up in a panic, realizing, oh my gosh, the body's gone, my gun's gone, what do I do? And Fareed turns and he sees there's this man at the end of the beach who's chopping wood. Now, Fareed has no idea that man is actually literally the killer of his cousin. He has no idea. He just thinks it's some random dude who lives at the end of this beach who's chopping wood. But Fareed, he's so desperate to salvage his job, he's gotta find this body, he's gotta find his gun. He's thinking, man, this guy, he lives so close to the crime scene, maybe he saw something strange. Maybe he can help me find the body and my gun. And so Fareed walks on down the beach, not realizing he's about to come face to face with his cousin's killer. Fast forward several hours, and Fareed's partner finally returns to the beach, now with a team of detectives, and they're ready to investigate. And Fareed's partner, at first glance, looks down to the sand and he sees, one person standing there next to what appears to be a headless body on the ground, and he thinks, okay, there's Fareed and there's the body. The scene is the same as it was when I left it. But when they got a little bit closer, Fareed's partner started to notice something. The body on the ground, it had the wrong clothes on. They're different than what the body had on last night. What's going on here? This discrepancy would be made clear once Fareed's partner got down right next to the body and really got a look at it. He saw clearly the body is not the same as the night before. It's not just the clothes. Fareed's partner didn't know this, but it's not Fareed's cousin. That's not who this is. But the body also did not belong to Fareed either. Fareed was standing right next to the body. In fact, it would turn out really nothing about the scene that Fareed's partner found on the beach that morning was what it appeared to be at first glance. He and the rest of the team had to spend the rest of the morning searching the beach and the entire neighboring village and conducting countless interviews with potential witnesses to finally put it all together and make sense of it. And by the end of that day, the story that they managed to put together was so totally bizarre that it made headlines all over the world. Because Fareed was so desperate to keep his job, when he walked down the beach to go talk to that man chopping wood to see if he knew anything about what happened to the body, where did it go, did you see anything strange? As he was talking to this guy, again, not knowing it is literally the killer of your cousin. Fareed doesn't know this. He thinks it's a complete stranger. Fareed starts having this idea. He's like, well, wait a minute. I have my knife. What if I kill this man? No one's here. Cut his head off and put his body over there. No one will know. I'll replace the body. And so that's what Fareed did. He murdered this man, believing it was just some random guy to save his job. He's standing there when the partner comes down and he's like, look, I guarded the body, but it wasn't the body. It was a guy he murdered to save himself, but it just so happened to be that the guy he murdered was literally the killer of his cousin. Had no idea. And so even though in sort of a roundabout, backwards, vigilante way, justice was done here, Fareed took out the killer of his own cousin, even though that did technically happen, Fareed was still arrested for murder. Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Mrballen Carr. Mrballen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pie, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pie is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pie and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pie and his kids, Peggy and Pie started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pie was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pie, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pie's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pie and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pie's now very rocky marriage, Pie suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pie, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling, and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just gonna go home, I'm gonna lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I wanna take it seriously, so I'm gonna leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's gonna sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's gonna be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door, she got in her car, and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside, she made her way to her bedroom, and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne, because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him, and so he kind of jostled her awake, and when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating, she obviously had not been sleeping, she was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back, and she would level with him, and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "She's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. She'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said, "No, she just suddenly started feeling this way." And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend, But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse, not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting these same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and sure enough, the next day the results came back, and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter, and they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband, it's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon, and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body, and how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great and they would head home. And then over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, "You know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not." And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company, and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all gonna die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gilek, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. And they just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy
Peggy and Pie and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pie and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pie reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pie and her family were out of their house. And then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife, Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry.
One night in the summer of 1921, a young man named Carl Logies walked across the farm that he had recently purchased in rural Ohio. He was on his way to check on his horses and his cattle one last time before he went to bed. He had a gun on his hip and a lantern in the other hand, and as he walked across the farm, he sort of looked out at the farmhouse and the barn up ahead and the water well and all this land, and he couldn't help but feel really proud of what he had. I mean, this was all his. So Carl had always dreamed of having this, of having his own farm. And he'd been able to get this one for a really low price because apparently the people who owned it before him had been very eager to get rid of it, and he had seen it as a great opportunity. Now, Carl didn't really know why they wanted to move it so badly, but he didn't care. It just meant he got a great deal. And so Carl continued walking over to the barn where his cattle and his horses were, and as he got closer, keep in mind it's dark out, it's late at night, he suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and he had this unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But Carl, he lives alone. It's just him and his animals. Like, there's no reason there would be anybody nearby to watch him. And so instinctively, Carl stops where he is and he whips around and he shines his lantern in all directions, just seeing if there's somebody there, but there's nobody. Granted, his field of vision is pretty limited. I mean, it's dark outside, his lantern's not that bright, but for the most part, he can tell that there's no one in the immediate vicinity. He's all alone. And so then his thought is, well, is there a predator nearby? I mean, is there an animal watching me? But Carl, he's looking around and it's a peaceful, quiet night, and the previous owners certainly hadn't mentioned any risk of predators in the area. And so Carl tells himself, he's just being paranoid. He's new to this property. He doesn't really know what it's like to be here. And so he tells himself, you're just overthinking it. Go to the barn, take care of your animals, and just go to bed. Everything is fine. And so Carl turns around and he walks over to the barn. He goes inside and he kind of busies himself getting the horses and the cattle ready for the night. And, he's in there for a few minutes. And for the most part, he's forgotten about that strange feeling he had when he came over, that feeling of being watched. But after he was wrapping up, he couldn't help but start to feel like he had that feeling again, that there was somebody watching him. And so he's looking out his barn door and he doesn't see anything, but it's dark out there, and he's kind of looking around the inside of his barn. And again, he's telling himself that you're being paranoid, everything is fine. But admittedly, deep down, Carl was feeling pretty nervous about just this walk he was going to have to make through the darkness across his property back over to the farmhouse. But, he steeled his resolve. He grabbed his lantern and he checked his gun on his hip. And then he walked out the doors of his barn and began quickly making his way towards his house. And as he's walking, he's kind of scanning both sides, checking to make sure nobody's out here, and he's not seeing anyone. And right as he's about halfway to his house, something catches his eye on the far side of the property, something kind of off in the distance. And he stops and he aims his lantern in that direction, which doesn't really illuminate that much, but it illuminates enough to see that there's actually somebody standing on his property. And he's so alarmed by it, he just stands there holding his lantern, looking at this person, and it's like this white silhouette just standing there still, looking right over at Carl. They're sort of in the vicinity of his water well. And after being frozen for a second, Carl kind of snapped out of it and he said, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" And this figure doesn't move, doesn't react. They just stand there kind of staring at Carl, and then they turn and begin kind of moving away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what's happening. He thinks that this person clearly is some sort of trespasser. They must have been here earlier. That's what I was feeling. They were here. They've been watching me. Are they gonna try to rob me? Who is this? And so he draws his gun and he starts chasing after this person. And as he's running, his lantern's waving back and forth. And as he's running, he loses sight of this white figure. And by the time he actually gets to the water well, he realizes he's lost this person. They're just gone. At this point, Carl really didn't know what to make of this. He didn't know where this person went. He has no idea if they've doubled back around and they're gonna try to go in his house at some point here. He does not understand what's happened or where they've gone. He doesn't know who they are. And so all he can think to do as he's standing there by the well, out of breath, from running there, is just to yell out that, he's got a gun and he's not afraid to use it, and don't you dare come back here. But despite yelling out these sort of open-ended threats into the darkness, there's no response. And he doesn't see this white figure anywhere. It's just dark and silent in all directions. And so for a while, Carl just stood there at the well, just, looking out, almost expecting to see this figure reappear, but they never did. And eventually, when it really felt like everything had kind of calmed down on his property, he just turned and run the rest of the way over to his farmhouse. He went inside and locked the door behind him. Now, the next morning when Carl woke up, he tried to tell himself that whatever happened the night before, it had to be an anomaly. Maybe that was a neighbor who had come over and they were shy, or maybe it was, a potential trespasser or a thief or something, and they were scared off by Carl's threats of being willing to use his weapon. Carl is telling himself that whatever that was last night, he likely would never encounter that person ever again, and it was handled. But Carl was wrong. Almost every single night from that night onward for the next year, at about 9:30 p.m. every night, around the time that Carl would go to the barn to check on his animals before bed, he would always see that figure. And they were never close enough that Carl could actually see who it was or get any sense of what they wanted. They were always just kind of off on the side of the property, always watching Carl every time he came out of the barn. And then when he would invariably scream at them and run towards them, and even at one point he fired his weapon in their direction. Every time, this figure would just, without saying anything, move away from Carl in the direction of the water well, and around there, Carl would lose sight of them. They would just vanish. Now, as much as Carl really wanted to pretend that this was just something explainable, that this was some person coming on his property that was evading his capture every single night, as much as he wished that could be the explanation, Carl knew, despite not being a very superstitious or, a believer in the paranormal, despite not being those things, he felt like what he was witnessing was a ghost. I mean, what else could it be? It's this white figure that floats away from him and vanishes every night. Like, that's a ghost. And also, another part of Carl was thinking, like, the previous owners were really excited to sell this property effectively at a loss. It's like they just wanted to be rid of this property. And he couldn't help but feel like, maybe there's a connection between what I'm seeing and why they left. But the one thing that Carl hung on to was that despite how unsettling this whole thing was and how terrifying it was to, see this figure floating around on his property, despite that, the reality is it was pretty predictable. Every night around 9:30, he would see this ghost, whatever it was, but it didn't really affect him or his animals. It was just terrifying. And he accepted that. It just sort of became his new normal. That is, until August 1st of 1922, which happened to be almost exactly a year after Carl had purchased this property. On that day, Carl noticed his horses, his cattle, they stopped drinking the water, the well water that he gave them all year long since he had been here. They had never had any issues with it, but on that day, they just stopped drinking it. And in fact, they were kind of skittish around the water, like there was something in the water that was upsetting them. Carl tasted the water, it tasted fine to him, but he assumed there just must be something in it that made it unclean to the animals. And so what he had to do was clean the water, which meant he needed to drain the well, get rid of all this dirty water, and let the well refill, and hopefully at that point it will be clean. So Carl goes over to the water well. Remember, this is always where the figure goes off and disappears to. And as the water began to drain, he realized there was something in the well, clearly deep in the well that he never would have been able to see unless he drained it. And here he is draining it, and he's looking down and he can't quite tell what it is, but eventually the water was shallow enough that it was obvious what was in the bottom of his well. And at that point, he went and got the sheriff. It would turn out 5 years earlier, Carl's farm had been owned by another man whose name was Frank Lerman. And Frank, when he was here, had multiple employees, including a young farmhand named Henry Lipenstick. And one day, Henry had gone missing. Henry didn't have any family or close friends who lived nearby, and so basically everybody in town assumed that Henry must have just left town. But one of Frank's neighbors had told the sheriff at the time that she didn't actually believe that. She thought maybe Frank himself had done something to Henry, because according to her, Frank and Henry argued all the time about money. Like there was clearly real tension between those two. The sheriff tried to look into Frank to see if there was any legitimacy to this claim. But at the same time this investigation was beginning, Frank abruptly sold his property and moved away. And without any real evidence, the sheriff couldn't prove there was any foul play involved. And so he just had to close the case and move on. Until Carl, 5 years later, drained that well. And suddenly, the Henry Lipenstick case was solved. Because at the bottom of the well, Carl found Henry's very decomposed body. He was practically skeletal by this point, but they could tell that was Henry. An autopsy later revealed that Henry had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. Frank was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder, but he only served 7 months before his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. When they pulled Henry's remains out of the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was wearing a watch, and the watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m., precisely the time that Carl, for a whole year, saw that white figure running off, disappearing over towards the water well where Henry's body was located. After Henry's body was properly buried, Carl never saw that white figure ever again. Also, it's believed that the previous owners right before Carl, who sold him the property at a discount, likely they were selling it because they too had seen Henry's ghost. Happy New Year, everybody. And to celebrate this new year, I actually have a pretty huge announcement. So beginning this Monday and going forward, we're going old school on this channel. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. And this is none of that oh, we edited it differently, so it's brand new. No, we're talking new content up to 4 times a week. So how will it actually work? Well, this week, you're gonna be getting new stories on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course, Saturday. Saturday is the same as it's always been and will continue to be. And then each and every week after that, you're gonna be getting 2, 3, even 4 brand new Mrballen episodes every single week. You've told me that you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and now you're gonna get it. Can't wait to see you guys. Thank you. Late one night in the winter of 1933, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg poured another round of drinks for all of his buddies who were sitting inside of one of Anton's many sitting rooms inside of his huge castle that he owned in southern Poland. And after pouring these drinks, Anton kind of clumsily began walking his way over to the table where his buddies were. And because Anton was pretty drunk, because he and his friends had been drinking for hours and playing cards and partying, Anton stumbled at some point and basically spilled half of the drinks onto the carpet. But because he was so drunk, he just thought it was really funny. And so did his friends. They were all roaring with laughter as he's on the carpet, picking up all these basically empty glasses. But then instead of going back and re-pouring the drinks, Anton, sort of as a joke, walked over to the table, sat down, and handed out these basically empty cups to his friends. And everybody thought it was so funny. And they didn't even get up to get more drinks. They were just all so drunk and happy, they just kept on playing their card game. And so as Anton's sitting there and everyone's laughing and smiling, the friend of his that was the dealer for this round of blackjack began to deal. But as he did, there was this sudden, really loud creaking sound that came from right above them. And it was so loud and so pronounced that even amongst this loud room of drunk men playing cards, everybody heard it. And there was a moment of silence where everyone sort of registered like, what's going on above us? And in this sudden stillness, Anton, he sort of made a jest and he goes, oh boy, that's the monk. Now, for the most part, everybody at the table, all of Anton's friends that were there, they had heard the story of the so-called hooded monk that apparently haunted the castle. That's at least what Anton would say. But one person who was there that night was a new friend of Anton's, and they had not heard of, the monk's story. And they said, well, what are you talking about? That's the monk. And immediately everyone's like, oh, geez, here we go. Because Anton, he looked over at the friends and he was like, oh, you haven't heard the story of the hooded monk? Let me tell you. And then Anton basically told this friend, as the rest of the friends are all like, give me a break, this is just crap, this is not real. But Anton would tell this person, this newbie, that when he took ownership of this huge castle, he was told that everything's fine, except there's one bedroom upstairs that's totally off limits, because apparently it is haunted by a hooded monk, an evil hooded monk that sort of patrols this room. And Anton told this friend that he actually had never gone in that bedroom because he believed the story was true, that maybe, just maybe, there really was a malevolent spirit, a hooded monk figure that was in there. And also, he had tons of bedrooms in his castle, he didn't need to go in there, but, right above us is that off-limits bedroom, and so maybe that creak we heard was the monk. Now, again, basically everybody in the room knew this story, because Anton loved to tell the story of how his castle was haunted. But that's all it ever was. It was just some story that Anton told. But this friend, when they heard this from Anton, their reaction was, wait a minute, you have a bedroom in this castle that you own that you literally haven't gone inside of because there's a ghost in there? Are you kidding me? You literally haven't gone in that room for that reason? And as they said it out loud, all of Anton's other friends sort of picked up on how cowardly it seemed for Anton to have never gone in. Suddenly this story just made it seem like Anton was just kind of a coward. And everybody just piled on. They're like, yeah, Anton, why haven't you gone in there? Come on, man, this is your castle. Go in that bedroom. And before long, Anton was no longer happy to be talking about the story. He was like, oh yeah, just forget about it, guys. Let's get back to our game. But nobody would let it go until finally they dared him hey, not only should you go in there, but tonight you should stay the night in that bedroom to show us that you're really not afraid. And eventually, because Anton was so drunk and he was sort of standing up for his pride, he finally said, fine, fine. I'll go in there and I'll spend the night. Fine, I'll show you that this is just a story, it's no big deal. Now, after Anton loosely agreed to this, he likely thought that, the guys will forget about this and we'll go back to playing cards, and by the end of the night, nobody's gonna make sure I really go into that bedroom tonight. Like, they're gonna forget about this. But no, the friends would not let this go. And at the end of the night, when they had kind of wound down their card game and everybody was feeling pretty tired, they all were like, okay, Anton, we're gonna walk you up to your bedroom to make sure you sleep inside of that haunted room. And because Anton had already publicly declared that he wasn't afraid and he would do it, he was like, okay, let's go. And so the group, with Anton in the lead, they left the sitting room and they went up the stairs to the second floor, and they go down the hallway to the bedroom where supposedly, this hooded monk ghost resided. And the door, it wasn't like barred up or anything, but again, Anton had never been in there, but he had grabbed the key. And Anton, he goes up and he sort of nervously unlocks the door, and then before pushing it open, he turns and looks at his friends and he's like, all right, I'm going in, trying to see if they really wanted him to do it. And all his friends are sort of looking at him sort of hesitantly, but they're like, yeah, go inside, go, do it. And Anton's like, all right. And he pushes the door open, and he and his friends, they all look inside. For the first time, Anton is now laying eyes on the inside of this bedroom. And really, there was not much to see. I mean, it was a bedroom, and there was old furniture in there that looked like it had been there for hundreds of years, covered in dust, and there's cobwebs everywhere, but it basically just looked like a really old bedroom that nobody used. And so his friends are like, all right, Anton, get in there. And Anton's like, all right, I'll see you in the morning. And he goes inside the room and he shuts the door. And then the friends, they all walked back down the hall, went into their respective bedrooms where they were sleeping, and everybody went to bed. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, as all the friends are all asleep, there's this sudden, extremely loud, blood-curdling scream that appeared to be coming from the bedroom where Anton was, inside the haunted room. And so the friends, they jump out of bed, they run into the hallway, they go down the hall, and they get to the door and they try to open it, the room that Anton's in, but it's locked. And they start banging on the door, yelling, Anton, are you okay? Are you okay? Because even though they had put him up to this, they had dared him to do this, they didn't really think there was any risk, but at the same time, maybe there was something bad in there, so they're worried. They're worried about Anton. They want to make sure he's okay. But after pounding and yelling on the door, there was no response. The haunted bedroom where Anton was completely silent. And the friends, they all kind of exchanged worried glances, and they're like, we got to get in there. We got to make sure he's okay. Something just feels wrong. That scream, that's somebody in danger. Like, Anton could be hurt here. And so they began smashing this door, ramming into it, until finally they literally blew the door off its hinges. And when they looked into the room and saw what was going on, they couldn't believe it. When Anton went into the bedroom to spend the night, his friends would recall hearing the sound of him turning the key and locking the bedroom door behind him. So Anton is in this haunted bedroom and he's locked inside, and there's no other way in or out of this bedroom. So he is in there totally alone and he's locked the door. So keep that in mind. So now, a few hours later, after hearing the scream, the friends blow the door open, literally knock it off its hinges because it was locked, and they find Anton. And he's dead. And he's laying on the bed on his back, and the only sign of something that happened to him is there's this red mark around his neck, like a ligature mark, a thin red ligature mark around his neck. But there's no rope or line anywhere in the room. There's no sign of a struggle. There's nothing else really in this room except for Anton. And he's just inexplicably dead with this mark on his neck. Authorities got involved and they searched the room top to bottom, and they never found any rope or any line, nothing that could have left those marks on his neck. And they also did an autopsy on Anton, but they couldn't figure out what his cause of death was. So just the fact that Anton died in this really inexplicable way in a bedroom that he claimed was haunted is pretty mysterious. But it becomes even more mysterious when you consider the whole story about this ghost that haunted this castle. So Anton, when he would typically tell the story, would just basically say, well, there's this evil hooded monk that is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and that's why I don't go in it. And that's kind of the whole story. But that's not the whole story. That's just kind of the version that Anton would tell. The whole story was, this castle has been haunted for hundreds of years. There is an evil monk that lives in that bedroom upstairs, and if you go in there, The evil monk will kill you by strangling you with a thin rope. That's the story. And so it really makes you wonder, because to this day, nobody knows how Anton Holberg died alone in that locked bedroom after seemingly being strangled by a rope that didn't exist. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1907, a 57-year-old man named Samuel Hughes was riding on a passenger train that was moving through southeastern Wales. Sam had spent basically the last 24 hours working the entire time. He was a salt merchant, and he had left the town where he lived, a town called Blackwood, and taken a train south about an hour to another town called Newport, where he did a lot of business. And basically all day Saturday, from early morning all the way until late at night, he had been working. And now finally, 1 a.m. on Sunday, he's back on a train heading back to his town in Blackwood. But despite how utterly exhausted he was on this ride back home, barely able to keep his eyes open, Sam was just so relieved that soon, very soon, he would get off the train, he'd be back in his house, and he could just collapse in bed. And so that's all he's thinking about. And so for a little bit longer, Sam is, fighting to keep his eyes open, and the train's rumbling along, and he can tell he's getting close to home. I mean, he rides this train all the time. This is a pretty, regular route for him. And then finally, Sam feels the train start to slow down, at which point he gathers up all his things. He gets up and kind of shuffles his way into the hall. And then once the train came to a full stop, he stepped off the train onto the platform, relieved that, he's now maybe 10 minutes from home. But as the train took off from the station, Sam, who's again standing on this platform, it's late at night here, he's looking around and he realizes something. In his stupor, in his exhaustion, he didn't realize this was not his stop. He had gotten off one stop too early. It was like he was on autopilot. He was so tired, he got off thinking he was home, but he wasn't. And now the train is gone. And remember, this is the early 1900s. He didn't have a quick way to get from where he was to his home. Like, there wasn't going to be another train anytime soon, nor did he know the train schedule. He also didn't have a way to call a cab or anything. It's 1, 2 in the morning here. And so Sam realizes he basically can either find a place to stay in whatever town this is, or he can basically walk to Blackwood, which is, a pretty good walk away, but he figured, maybe, this town was close enough he could do it. And so he figured, his first step here is just leave the platform and just go find somebody, anybody in town that maybe is out and about, and just kind of figure out where we are. How do I get to Blackwood? Is there a hotel nearby or an inn or something? But he needs to go find somebody. And so even though Sam at this point is furious with himself and really just wants to spend time dwelling on the fact that he's made this mistake, he's sort of over that, and he's just focused on finding a solution. And so Sam leaves the platform and he starts walking, in the general direction of lights that he sees off in the distance. But this is a small train platform. He's clearly not near any major city. It's pretty much dark and just rural roads going in different directions. And so he really does not have high hopes that he's gonna run into anybody anytime soon. But surprisingly, after leaving the platform and walking not very far, he got to an intersection where he saw another person walking up the other street. And he quickly realized it was a police officer. And so Sam is so relieved, an authority figure, they can help me. And he flags down the police officer, and the officer comes over, and they're kind of sizing up Sam, like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night, you got luggage with you, like, what's going on here? And Sam explained the mistake he had made and asked the officer, like, hey, is there a place to stay here? Or maybe, is it walkable to get to my town, Blackwood? And the officer would tell him, like, there is places to stay in this town, but if you're up for it, it would only take you, maybe an hour if you did want to make the walk to Blackwood. And, if I was in your shoes, I might do that. And Sam, he thought about it and he was like, you know what? I do. I just want to get home. I want to get in my own bed. So yes, just point me in the right direction. And so the officer, he explained to Sam that luckily it's really simple. You just basically go straight down that road and you walk for about an hour until you reach a bridge. Once you get over the bridge, follow some signs, and it'll be really obvious that you're right near Blackwood, and you'll make it the rest of the way. And so Sam thanked the officer and then gathered up his things, and he began walking in the direction of his town. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m., Sam's wife, Bess, was awake inside of their home in Blackwood. She was awake because she was waiting for Sam to get home. She knew he would have a long day in Newport, but by now she knew he should be home. I mean, he went on this trip fairly regularly. She knew how long it took, even on the long end. And it being 3 a.m. and him not being home was starting to be pretty concerning. And so she's up, she's kind of anxious, and all of a sudden, she hears Sam calling out to her. He's clearly out in front of the property. You know, he must have known that she was awake. He could see the lights on inside the house, and he was calling out to her that, he was returning. And so Bess, she's overcome with relief. She knows her husband is safe. She grabs a candle and she goes to the front door to greet her husband. She opens the door and she looks out, and it's not her husband. Her husband is nowhere to be found. Instead, there is this dark figure standing on her porch, just inches away, looking right at Bess. And Bess, she freezes when she sees it, but she isn't scared. There's a weird calm about what she's looking at. She doesn't know what it is. She has no idea what to do, but she's just standing there, calm, as this figure is right in front of her, not moving. And as she's just staring at it, she realizes it's dressed in this long black cloak, and it had on a black silk hat. And her husband always wore a black silk hat, and she knew specifically he had worn it that morning when he went to Newport. And so for a minute, she's just staring sort of unbelievably at this apparition, apparently wearing clothes, at least a hat, that belonged to her husband, and she knows she just heard her husband call to her. She didn't imagine that. He just called to her, but then Bess blinked, and the figure just vanished. The hat, the cloak, it's all just gone, and there's nobody standing on her porch. And now Bess is scared, because as much as there was a calm about this figure, now she's thinking, did I just imagine that? What's going on here? Is my husband outside somewhere? Did he call to me because he's hurt or something? And so she leaves her house with this candle, and she's running around her house calling out for Sam, but Sam's not out there. And so eventually Bess goes back inside the house and just continues to sit up waiting for Sam. But Sam doesn't come home. And eventually, by 5 or 6 in the morning, Bess just goes to bed. When Bess woke up later that afternoon, Sam still had not come home yet. But now, the sun is out, and she's telling herself that weird thing that happened last night, she must have imagined that, that didn't happen. And, Sam's fine, he'll be home. He's stayed late before and not told me, everything's okay. But as Bess is reassuring herself that everything's okay, she hears a knock on the front door. And for a second, she thinks maybe it's Sam, maybe he's home. But she goes to the door, she opens it up, and it's a police officer. And he just says to her, "I have some terrible news." It would turn out the night before, when Sam met that police officer who told him to walk this way to get back to Blackwood, well, Sam had followed the directions, and apparently he was on the right path because he got all the way to that bridge that the officer said would, demarcate that he was close to Blackwood. But perhaps because he was so exhausted, or maybe just because it was still so dark outside, he fell off the bridge to his death. And so the police officer is telling Bess this, and she's totally overcome with grief. But then for whatever reason, her mind immediately went to that dark figure she saw on the porch a little after 3 a.m. And without really thinking this through, she just said to the officer, "What time do you think he died?" And the officer was like, "Well, based on the officer that directed Samuel in that direction, towards the bridge, and how long it would have taken him to get there, we estimate he likely fell off the bridge around 3 in the morning." And so for Bess, she's thinking, that's around the same time I saw that figure on my porch. And then she also began to think about that hat, the black silk hat that Sam always wore, that she knew he had worn that morning when he went to Newport. And so Bess's next question was, well, when you found him, was he wearing his black silk hat? And the officer was kind of confused and said, no, he wasn't wearing a hat at all. And so when Bess heard that, those details confirmed that who or what she saw on her porch earlier that morning, the dark figure with the black silk hat, that must have been Sam's soul. He was coming to say goodbye to his wife because he had just fallen off the bridge and died. And, this figure having that black silk hat on was a way of showing her that, yes, that really was her husband. Bess would later tell this story to a reporter who would have this story printed all over Wales, and that's how we know it today. At 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, A man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate two-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing Brandon. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he's trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so what he wanted Kyle to do was to, right now in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this, he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these 3 men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon. Because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon's telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no 3 men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again. And he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He'd been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he'd been working on, being a better partner to his fiancée, Ladessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here's where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, don't do it. You should not get high. You're clean. You're doing good. But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened, because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle didn't give him any, resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyways, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. He was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because, there's no such thing as these 3 men. You're just high. He's not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He's thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he's continuing to talk about these 3 men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him, come give me the gas I need so I can escape, come on, man. At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon, and in some ways he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. This was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities. He shouldn't be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if, he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what? I'm just gonna go out on Highway 277, I'm gonna find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he'd be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277, along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone, so she'd insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is like a desolate highway. There's no real traffic, and really in either direction, it's just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. This is a big, wide open area. It's pretty easy to see way out in front of you. And so he's got a great view, even though it's nighttime, but he can't see any vehicles. There's no truck, there's nothing. His brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. He was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off, it's just sitting there. It's not even idling. It's clearly turned off. But as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road and he parks his car and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car and he's gonna go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck, waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind at this point Kyle's thinking, well, there's nobody else out here. There's no 3 men chasing my brother. He's probably just sitting here, high as can be, and I'm gonna talk to him and he's just gonna go home and we're gonna move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon's gone. And he's thinking to himself, this really doesn't make any sense because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here. They're gaining on me like I'm in trouble. Bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he's here, he's finally reached clearly Brandon's truck. It's right here. And Brandon's gone? He's gone from his truck? He didn't tell him that on the phone. Like, where is he? What's going on here? And so Kyle, he's like looking under the vehicle. He's searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what's his brother doing here? But as he's searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings, and it's Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he's like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I'm right here. And Kyle's like, no, you're not. Like, I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here. You're not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he's on the phone with Brandon. He's looking out at this cop car that's coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down, like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He's watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he's sort of quickly interpreting this and he's thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he's looking out and it's just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It's like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There's nowhere to hide. There's a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but like there's really nowhere to hide. So where is Brandon? And Kyle, he's just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It's like, what are you doing, Brandon? Like, he knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so he's just protecting himself, like, don't get involved with the police, like, keep me out of it. And it's like, Kyle, he's already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who's completely off his rocker. Like, he was so annoyed, but again, it's like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here. But Brandon hung up. Now, by this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle. He's put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department, and he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he wanted to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that, well, the reason my brother left his car here is because he's probably high on meth and he's somewhere nearby hiding. And also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, well, I think he went off to get some gas because he called me and he said he had run out of gas. So he parked his car here. So he probably has walked on and I just got here. Is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? Because I'm sure he's fine, but he called me to help get him gas. So do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. And so Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway. And as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was gonna do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so at this point, Kyle has no idea what's going on with Brandon. I mean, he didn't before, but now especially, he's out of contact with his brother. And so Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, like continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it's so late and he's tired. And Kyle's wife is tired, it's 2 a.m. And Kyle, he's just so over it. He's like, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home. And so that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there, so Brandon clearly is still in hiding. And standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neil. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. He drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon and he'll tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened, but you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neil on his way back home, Neil decided, you know what, I'm not just gonna sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk. And then his brother showed up and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neil figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It doesn't seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning around 8 a.m., Deputy Neil was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neil was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he's out on foot, walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him. And that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or, got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he's gonna get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neil really had to go follow up personally with Brandon just to make sure he was okay. And so Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he didn't have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother, Kyle, had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so the first thing Neil did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly, it became clear to Deputy Neil that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Kyle went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they didn't understand how serious this situation really was. And so now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really didn't know what had happened to him and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we don't know, but he really is missing and you gotta go look for him. And so that's what Neil did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neil led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they had seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so Deputy Neil and the rest of the authorities who were involved in this search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled. That he's not here because he chose not to be here, that he was never in any danger, he fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case, until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset. And she said that she'd gotten so worried about Brandon that she'd started searching through their cell phone records. And she had found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her, because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she's like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just doesn't make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department. Because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neil got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed. And at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really didn't know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then two, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before it cuts out.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. We're just pushing some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
And so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there's another voice and he's talking about being chased through the woods and there's these men coming after him, I mean, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ladessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they too also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. You know, maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him, and maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277 to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. They, this small group of volunteers, would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly, a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it? Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff. Yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, either they just didn't see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas where it's easy to see anything, they just didn't see him. So that's option 1. Or 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option 2, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still don't have a good answer.